kindness that kills you. 10 Stoic warnings about the most dangerous virtue you never questioned there is a question that almost no one is willing to ask out loud, because the moment you form the words in your own mouth, you feel like a betrayer. You feel like the kind of person who is missing something fundamental. The kind of person a small child would not pick, in an emergency, to be their advocate. The question is this: what if the kindness you have been taught to perform your entire life is quietly hollowing you out? Not as a figure of speech, not as some poetic exaggeration that lets the reader feel sorry for themselves without actually changing anything. As a literal fact, written in the way your shoulders have started to hunch, in the way your sleep has gotten worse while your calendar has gotten fuller, in the way you can no longer remember the last time you did something purely because it brought you alive. What if the very habits your parents praised, the exact gestures your teachers rewarded, the precise behaviors your culture decorates with gold stars from elementary school all the way through to your most recent performance review are the same habits now bleeding you of the energy you no longer have, contaminating the relationships you used to trust, and leaving you staring at a ceiling at 3 in the morning wondering, in a voice too tired to even phrase the question properly, what is wrong with me? Run the tape of your last week. A friend who asked you to lie for them with a smile while you were already running late. A colleague who slid their entire mess across your desk at 4:45 on a Friday with a wink, with a story about how their kid was sick, with the implicit understanding that you would absorb it because that is what you do. A family member who called you at midnight with a crisis that had been quietly assembling itself for weeks and that by the time it reached your phone had somehow been transformed into a problem only you were equipped to solve. You said yes. You always say yes. And in the second you said it, you felt the familiar warmth arrive, the small seductive satisfaction of being needed, of being good, of being the kind of human being a room full of more careless humans can count on. But here is what no one involved in the transaction ever says out loud. The warmth is engineered. It was installed in you when you were 6 or 9 or 12 by people whose intentions were good but whose curriculum was not. The warmth is the trap dressed in a Sunday dress. And 3 days later, when the favor has not been returned and the second request has arrived, and you have started to notice that your own work has not been touched in 11 days, the warmth begins to curdle. What replaces it is colder, heavier, quieter, a slow, surname less resentment that lives in the chest like a small animal you keep feeding because you do not yet know what it is. An exhaustion that does not yield to sleep. A creeping, undefendable suspicion that you have given away so much of yourself to other people that when you finally look inward at the end of an ordinary day, there is almost nothing in there worth looking at. Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic philosopher, who happened to also be the emperor of Rome, who carried the administrative weight of an entire civilization on a single pair of shoulders for almost 2 decades, who buried children and friends and mentors and watched plagues consume entire provinces under his command, wrote something in the private journals he never intended any other human being to read. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. He was not talking about becoming cold. He was not talking about becoming selfish. He was warning against something considerably more dangerous than simple cruelty. He was warning against the slow, socially celebrated self-destruction that comes from giving without offense around the giving, from mistaking sacrifice for virtue, from trading your interior life, one favor at a time, for the applause of a room that has been quietly training you to applaud yourself out of existence. The Stoics understood something about the actual mechanics of human nature that most of us refuse to accept, because accepting it would require us to give up a story we have been telling ourselves since childhood. They understood that kindness without wisdom is not kindness at all. It is weakness wearing a noble mask. And weakness in the actual world is rarely rewarded. It is reliably, repeatedly, almost without exception exploited. Today we pull the mask off. What follows is not an attack on kindness. It is an attack on kindness without structure, looked at without sentimentality, 10 mechanisms by which a human being who genuinely believes they are being kind and who is being praised by everyone around them for being kind can quietly erode the entire foundation of their one and only life. And then, what the Stoics, what serious modern psychology, and what some of the most exacting minds in recorded history actually did about it. Stay, because what you are about to read may be the most honest thing anyone has said to you in years, including you to yourself. Destruction 1, the invisible invoice you keep handing to people. The first way kindness hollows you out is so subtle that most people genuinely do not see it operating. It works like this. When you are reliably, predictably, consistently the one who gives. When you accommodate, sacrifice, smooth over, anticipate, volunteer. When your behavior, week after week, signals to everyone in your orbit that you have no bottom, what begins to develop, deep in the architecture of your own unconscious, is something psychologists call an inflated expectation of reciprocity. You begin to expect not with your conscious mind, not with anything you would ever admit out loud, but with the deep procedural machinery that drives most of your behavior without your noticing, that because you have given so much, the universe, or at least the people who populate the actual rooms you walk through, will return it. In equal measure. With interest, ideally, you do not say this. You might not even be fully aware that you believe it. But the belief is there, embedded in your behavior the way a splinter is embedded under the skin, invisible at the surface, but producing low-grade inflammation that has been quietly draining you for years. And then life does what life always does, in the end, without exception, across every nation and every century. It does not return what you gave. The friend you drove to the airport for the 9th time cannot find 15 minutes to call you back during the worst week of your year. The colleague whose career you propped up with your private advice and your unpaid overtime gets the promotion that should have been yours, in a ceremony you were not invited to. The partner you poured yourself into for years poured your attention, your patience, your better qualities. The version of you that would have been a more interesting partner if there had been anyone left at home to entertain, looks at you across a kitchen table one evening and says, with the careful softness of someone who has already made the decision before opening their mouth, I feel disconnected. And what rises in your chest in that moment is not merely sadness. Sadness is small. Sadness is something you can metabolize. What rises is something considerably larger. It is betrayal. And betrayal, when it arrives from someone you gave to without ever having drawn up a contract that specified what you would receive in exchange, without anyone having ever agreed to your unspoken terms, without any of the negotiation that would have entitled you to feel wronged in the first place, is one of the most quietly corrosive emotions a human nervous system is capable of producing over a sustained period. Epictetus knew this. He, the Stoic philosopher who was born into slavery, who lived in chains, who had every conceivable reason to be permanently broken by the cruelty of the world that had been arranged around him without his consent, wrote, in the manual he eventually produced for the permanent use of any human being who wanted to stop being wrecked by their own reactions, seek not that the things which happen should happen as you wish, but wish the things which happen to be as they are. Then you will have a tranquil flow of life. He was not telling you to stop caring. He was telling you something much more precise than that. He was telling you that the moment you attach your emotional well-being to what other people will or will not do for you, you have handed them the master key to your entire inner life. You have made them the author of your happiness. And people, even good people, especially good people, even the people who love you most clearly and most sincerely will, in the actual world you are living inside of, always disappoint you. Not because they are malicious, not because they are indifferent to your suffering. They will disappoint you because they are human, and they are busy, and they are carrying their own particular arrangement of shadows that you have never once been asked about. The Stoic solution is not to stop giving. The Stoic solution is to give without the hidden invoice. Give because the giving reflects who you have chosen to be, not because you are running an unwritten transaction that the universe has never agreed to honor. Because the second your generosity becomes a loan in disguise, and most chronically kind people's generosity has for years been a loan in disguise without their noticing, you have not actually been kind at all. You have been a particularly quiet form of manipulative. And the person who suffers most from that manipulation, in every case, without exception, is you. Destruction 2, you quietly unmake the people you are trying to help. The second destruction is so common it has become almost invisible. We have a familiar psychological name for the original version: learned helplessness. The experimental condition in which a subject, after enough exposure to uncontrollable stress, stops trying to escape it. But here the principle is operating in reverse. It is not you who is becoming helpless. It is the people around you. And the conditions that have produced their helplessness were created, with the best of intentions, by you. Here is how the machinery runs. Every time you solve someone's problem for them before they have had the chance to try. Every time you step in when the difficulty of the situation would have taught them something irreplaceable. Every time you answer a question the other person was already formulating an answer to. Every time you plan the trip, cover the check. Smooth the conflict. Write the difficult email, you are transmitting a message. The message has not been written down. It has not been spoken out loud. But it has been received, completely and without ambiguity, in the body of every person you have helped in this way. The message is, you cannot do this without me. And the terrifying thing, the thing people who are kind by default almost never notice. Because they are usually too busy being kind to read the downstream effects of their kindness, is what happens next. After long enough, the person you have been helping starts to believe it. Seneca, who was not only one of the deepest Stoic minds in recorded history, but also one of the wealthiest and most politically connected men in Rome, the kind of man whose entire social calendar was populated by people who needed things from him, wrote, in one of his letters to his friend Lucilius, "It is not because I am brave that I endure. It is because I refuse to allow what is external to disturb what is internal." He had spent his life observing power, and his observation was this. And worse the part the chronic helpers never want to see, they eventually begin to resent you for it, even as they rely on you. Resent you for the very quality that makes you help them in the first place. Because somewhere beneath the comfort of being carried is buried the deep, humiliating awareness that they need to be carried at all. Consider the parent who does their child's homework each evening with the careful attention they imagine they are providing as a form of love. The manager who quietly rewrites every email their team member sends because the rewriting is faster than waiting for the team member to learn. The friend who always picks up the check, always plans the trip, always shows up with the solution that has the side effect of rendering everyone else in the room unnecessary. In each case, the surface looks like kindness. Beneath the surface, something slower and considerably more consequential is happening. The capability of the other person is being eroded. Their confidence in their own judgment is being quietly defunded. Their sense of dignity, the kind of dignity that can only be built through surviving a difficult thing on your own initiative, is being replaced by an arrangement that feels, to both parties, increasingly like dependency. And then one day, and this is the day that the kind person never saw coming, because they were too busy being kind to look, the person they have been helping walks away, or turns on them, or calmly takes everything that has been freely given and disappears without any of the closure that would have permitted the giver to make sense of what just happened. And the giver sits alone, asking the wrong question. How could they have done this to me, after everything I gave them? When the answer was there the entire time. You robbed them of the very struggle that would have made them capable of meeting you as an equal. And human beings do not love the people who have made them feel small, even when the smallness arrived gift wrapped in generosity. Destruction 3, you are not being selfless. You are fleeing from yourself. The third way excessive kindness will hollow you out is the one that kind people deny with a defensiveness that is, when you watch it from any distance at all, almost comical in its intensity. They will list their achievements for you. They will tell you about their full calendar, their carefully managed life, their branching network of people who depend on them, their polished productivity system. They will explain, with the conviction of someone who has rehearsed the explanation, that they simply have a generous personality, that this is who they are, that the alternative would be selfishness, and they are constitutionally opposed to selfish people. And then you ask them a single question that stops the entire presentation cold. When was the last time you sat alone, in a quiet room, with no tasks to complete and no one to help and no screen to consult, and just existed? Not scrolling, not planning, not solving someone else's urgent problem, just sitting with yourself. If that question produces in you anything other than immediate relief, what you are experiencing is not a personality trait. It is a symptom. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist who spent the better part of his professional life mapping the actual interior landscape of the human mind with the kind of patient thoroughness that almost no one before or after him has managed, wrote extensively about what he called the shadow. The parts of ourselves we refuse, on purpose and with considerable emotional investment, to acknowledge. The parts we keep carefully hidden even from our own conscious awareness, because acknowledging them would require us to feel what we have spent years ago constructing walls to avoid feeling. Jung observed, and the observation has been confirmed, in different idioms, by a century of subsequent clinical research, that many people bury themselves in busyness and giving not because they actually love giving. They bury themselves because stillness would force them to confront the parts of themselves they are most afraid of, the grief they have not yet finished metabolizing, the ambition they abandoned quietly enough that no one noticed and they did not have to admit the abandonment out loud. The voice, persistent and immovable, that has been quietly informing them for years, in the small hours, in the gaps between useful activity, that they are not enough, that they will never be enough, that the only escape from this voice is to keep moving, keep producing, keep absorbing everyone else's emergencies before their own has time to surface. Marcus Aurelius dealt with this pattern privately in the same journals I quoted earlier. He wrote repeatedly about the temptation to seek validation from the outside world, and he identified it with the unflinching honesty of a man who refused to lie to himself, even when lying would have been more comfortable as one of the most corrosive forces a human being can quietly allow into their own house. Never esteem anything as of advantage to you that will make you break your word or lose your self-respect. He understood that self-abandonment, even the self-abandonment performed in the name of virtue, even the self-abandonment that is applauded at dinner parties and rewarded in annual reviews, is still abandonment. But they pushed farther than the metaphor. They argued, with the kind of bluntness that requires real courage from a teacher, that a life spent in the service of others while deliberately avoiding the harder interior work of examining yourself is not a virtuous life at all. It is an escape. And escapes, every single one of them, no matter how noble they appear at the surface, always end in exactly the same place: alone. Facing what you were running from. Except now, the thing you were running from is bigger, and you are more exhausted, and you have less time than you did when you started running. Destruction for the world does not reward endless availability. The fourth destruction is the one most kind people refuse to accept, because accepting it requires them to look, clearly and without flinching, at the way the world actually operates as opposed to the way they have been quietly insisting it operates. The world does not respect you for being constantly available. It does not feel deep, sustained gratitude for the person who never says no. It does not honor, with any meaningful consistency, the role of the human being who is simply always there, the way furniture is always there, the way a wall is always there, the way air conditioning is always there. What the world does, what human beings in all of the available research and across all of the documented history do, reliably, predictably, almost without exception, is test the boundaries of what is available to them. And when they encounter no boundary, when they encounter a person who has no boundary, they keep pushing. Behavioral science has a term for this mechanism. It is called, with a name that sounds clinical until you understand what it is actually describing, the scarcity principle. Objects that are rare are perceived as valuable. Opportunities that disappear are pursued with more energy than opportunities that wait patiently. People who have limits on their time command more respect, more attention, more genuine engagement than people who are sitting right there immediately in the chair with no friction between themselves and whoever is asking. This is not a theory. It is one of the most rigorously replicated findings in the entire history of social psychology. It applies to you. It is applying to you right now if you happen to be a kind person who has spent any significant portion of the last calendar year saying yes to things your own judgment had already quietly rejected. When you are always available, you become background. When you always say yes, your yes becomes indistinguishable from the silence that would have been produced by your absence. When you always give, your giving stops being a gift and starts being viewed by the people on the receiving end as an unvarying feature of the environment. A law of nature. A promise, in fact, that you will keep saying yes even when the asking has become undisguised self-interest, because the yes has become free. And the moment your yes becomes free, the moment it is treated as background, the moment your generosity is no longer perceived as a choice but as a permanent feature of the landscape, you have lost something that is almost impossible to recover. Your perceived value in the eyes of the people who have quietly rearranged their assumptions around your infinite availability is gone. This is what the Stoics meant when they talked about the difference between living according to reason and living according to impulse. The impulse is to help, to give, to be needed. Reason, cold and clear and unsentimental, knows something the impulse does not. Being endlessly generous without a boundary does not make people love you more. It makes them respect you less. History gives us a near-perfect case study. Abraham Lincoln, preserved in the American memory as one of the most morally serious leaders the country ever produced, was also, in private correspondence and behind closed cabinet doors, ruthlessly strategic about when to extend grace and when to hold firm. He wrote in a letter to a law partner, in language that has been misquoted and aestheticized so many times that the actual content has been obscured, "Give me 6 hours to chop down a tree, and I will spend the first 4 sharpening the axe." He was not talking about trees. He was not talking about the literal forest outside his office window. He was talking about the structure of deliberate, bounded action. He was talking about the difference between giving with intention and giving as a compulsive release valve that has not been maintained since childhood. Say no. Not always. Not loudly. Not as a wall. Not as a punishment. Not as a permanent rejection of every human hand that is extended in your direction. Say no strategically, clearly, calmly, as a living, breathing human boundary that has been deliberately installed by someone who has decided their own interior life is not less important than anyone else's emergency. Because every time you say no to something that diminishes you, you are, at the exact same moment, saying yes to something that restores you. And the people worth keeping in your life will not vanish because you have a spine. They will respect you more for the spine being visible, when you are known across the circles you have built your life inside as the giver, as the helper, as the human being who is always available, who never makes demands, who absorbs inconvenience the way a paper towel absorbs spill. You begin, without anyone signing any contract, to attract a very particular type of person into the orbit of your life, not a random sample of humanity. A curated selection, hand-picked by your own behavior, with the unconscious precision of an algorithm that has been quietly optimizing toward a result you did not intend. You attract people who are looking, very specifically, for someone to give to them. And over time, the people in your life begin to skew slowly, invisibly, across years, that each, individually, looked reasonably normal in a single direction. Takers. This is not a moral judgment on the takers themselves. Some of them are in genuinely hard seasons and need what you can provide and would, given the time and the safety, develop into people who could reciprocate. Some of them were never taught, by anyone in the long chain of people who raised them, how to reciprocate, because no one in their life ever required it of them. But the effect on you, regardless of the cause, is the same. You end up surrounded by people who, on balance, drain you. And you find yourself, with no clear memory of when this started happening, mysteriously and inexplicably alone in exactly the moments you most need someone to show up. The ancient Stoics were deeply interested in the question of who to spend a life around. Aristotle, who was not technically a Stoic, but whose work on friendship functioned as the foundation that the entire Stoic conversation about human relationships was later built on top of, wrote extensively about the difference between what he called genuine friendship and what he called friendships of utility or pleasure. He argued with the empirical patience of a man who had spent his life observing actual human dynamics rather than arguing about them in lecture halls that most of what we casually call friendship is, on close inspection, a transaction. Two people are in sustained contact because one needs what the other provides, and the needs are temporary and small enough that the asymmetry of the arrangement does not surface for years, until one of them stops needing for a single quarter and the other person quietly disappears. This is not cynicism. It is observation. And if you look, with genuine honesty and without flinching from what you find, at the actual circle of people you are currently calling your friends, you will see the pattern operating in real time. The people who call when they need something, and who go silent when they do not. The people who show up for the parts of your life that are interesting from the outside, and who evaporate during the parts that are not. The people who celebrate publicly with you on the days worth celebrating, and who are nowhere to be found on the days that are hard, on the days you would have reached out first if you had not, over the preceding year, gotten into the habit of swallowing that impulse because the previous attempt had produced a void where someone should have been. Seneca wrote to Lucilius, in one of those letters that still reads like it was written last Tuesday rather than 20 centuries ago, withdraw into yourself as much as you can. Associate with those who will make a better man of you. Welcome those whom you yourself can improve. He was prescribing something considerably more radical than the word curation usually communicates. He was prescribing a deliberate, rational, ongoing rewrite of the social world you have arranged around yourself. Not as isolation, not as coldness, but as the conscious, repeated decision to invest your finite, unrecoverable energy in people who invest back, even imperfectly, even clumsily, even at a level that does not match what you have been putting in. Because your energy is finite. Your time is finite. And who you give both of those to is, when you sit down and look at the actual ledger, one of the most consequential decisions you will ever make. Destruction 6 quantity of kindness produces active suspicion. The 6th destruction is one of the darkest, and it is the one that chronically kind people most urgently need to hear, because it is the one they most desperately want to believe is not true. Here it is. When you are too kind, people do not only take advantage of you, they begin to suspect your motives. They begin to distrust you. This sounds, on first listen, like one of the crueler ironies the universe has arranged. Stay with it. Because on second listen, it will begin to make a kind of cold sense that is worth following all the way down. Look at it from the outside, the way a reasonable observer and most people, beneath their emotional reactions and their social training. Our reasonable observers looks at the behavior of someone who is relentlessly, unconditionally, in every imaginable circumstance, generous in the actual world. Unconditional generosity is rare. Things that are rare and difficult to obtain are, again, by that same scarcity principle that produced the previous destruction, perceived as valuable. So when someone appears to be giving freely, without limit, without complaint, in defiance of every normal expectation about how human behavior actually works, the rational question, the one that the mind constructs without asking permission, is, what am I not seeing here? What is this person getting out of this? What do they want that they have not told me? You have done this yourself. You have met someone who was almost aggressively nice, who complimented everything, who accommodated everyone, who never seemed to have a bad day, who never expressed any preference that interfered with anyone else's preference, who, in short, seemed to be a person without edges. And you felt, somewhere underneath the pleasantness, a faint and uncomfortable suspicion that you had no language for. That is the suspicion the Stoic was warning you about, and it is producing itself around you with every additional unsolicited act of generosity you perform. The psychologist Robert Cialdini, in his landmark body of work on the actual science of influence and persuasion, found something he called the pratfall effect. What his research demonstrated, in study after study, was that people trust and genuinely connect with other people who display both positive and negative qualities, the competent colleague who is also occasionally visibly human, the impressive leader who is occasionally visibly uncertain considerably more than they connect with people who present as uniformly, unrelievedly positive. Because perfection, sustained without slippage, creates distance. Imperfect humanity, displayed honestly, creates the conditions for genuine connection. Marcus Aurelius did not pretend in his journals. He wrestled. He expressed doubt. He admitted, to himself, to the page, to no one else, that he had been afraid on a morning when an emperor should not have been afraid. That he had been petty on a day when an emperor should not have been petty. That he had allowed himself to be distracted by trivialities at precisely the moment when the trivialities had no business claiming his attention. He was not performing virtue. He was practicing it, imperfectly, honestly, in the full view of his own demanding conscience. And that honesty, and the willingness to be seen as imperfect, is the reason his writing still feels, more than 18 centuries after his death, like the writing of an actual human being rather than the polished propaganda of an empire. Be honest. Be imperfect. Let people see that you have limits, that you have preferences, that you sometimes say no, that you sometimes feel genuinely tired of being leaned on, that you sometimes put yourself deliberately and without apology ahead of someone else's immediate need. Because the alternative, the polished, frictionless, limitless performance of being endlessly good does not make you lovable. It makes you suspect. And in a world where genuine trust has become the most valuable currency there is, that suspicion will quietly cost you everything you were trying to earn by being so reliably, so suspiciously kind. Destruction 7 chronic giving sets up addiction. The seventh destruction reaches deeper. It arrives beneath the everyday surface into something darker, and something a surprisingly large number of endlessly giving people will recognize instantly the moment they hear it described. There is a predictable clinical pattern that operates on a population of people who have been chronically depleted for years. The hunger for relief becomes overwhelming. And the nervous system, which can tolerate only so much sustained depletion before it begins to demand shortcuts, starts producing those shortcuts unsupervised. This is not speculation. The clinical literature on burnout, on codependency, on the actual mechanisms of addiction across populations is consistent and unambiguous. People who identify strongly for years as the helpers, the caretakers, the givers, the ones who are always there, show statistically elevated rates of substance use, of disordered eating, of compulsive behaviors, of other forms of self-medication designed not to produce pleasure exactly, but to produce, as quickly as the body can arrange it, the absence of pain. Not because they are weak, not because they lack willpower, but because a nervous system that has been chronically depleted for years will, with the quiet inevitability of a tide coming in, find a way to fill the vacuum. Carl Jung put his finger on the underlying mechanism. In one of those observations that stayed with the field for the better part of a century, every form of addiction is bad, no matter whether the narcotic be alcohol, morphine, or idealism. He was pointing at the darkest version of the pattern, the version where the drug is not a substance at all. The drug is the giving itself. The person who cannot stop giving, and I am talking now about the people who have, on close self-examination, noticed that something inside them will not let them stop, even when they are not enjoying it, and not being thanked for it, and not wanting to do it anymore, that person is not being kind. They are addicted to the brief, momentary relief of being useful. Because the alternative to being useful is to sit with the inner emptiness the usefulness has been designed by their own unconscious to obscure. Seneca, who wrote The Way Most People Breathe constantly, automatically about everything, put the recovery move into a single sentence that can be carried as a daily practice. Begin at once to live, and count each separate day as a separate life. He was not telling anyone to wait for the right moment. He was prescribing presence. The deliberate choice to be here, in this exact moment, in your own body and your own experience, rather than perpetually, systematically escaping into service, into busyness, into the exhausting performance of being so constantly needed that the question of what you yourself need never has the chance to surface. If you are the person who is always there for everyone else, the one who drives the airport runs, the one whose phone never goes to voicemail when someone is in trouble, the one who reorganizes their week to absorb someone else's emergency without protest, and if you have noticed yourself reaching, in the evenings, for the wine or the screen or the second bag of something that you were not actually hungry for, or the late night episode you will not remember the next morning, ask yourself, with genuine precision, what are you not feeling? What would you have to sit with, alone, in the quiet, if you stopped? Because the answer to that question is not the problem you have been trying to avoid naming. It is the beginning of the solution. There is a paradox that lives quietly at the center of excessive kindness. The more you give to someone, the more likely you are to silently, steadily, and invisibly begin to resent them. Not because they are bad, not because the love you have carried for them is false, not because they have done something unforgivable that you could put into words if you were asked to do so. They probably haven't. They are probably just a normal, complicated, occasionally distracted human being trying to live their own life. The resentment is happening because of something else. Because resentment is what happens to the unexpressed needs that have been piling up day after day, year after year, in a body that has been giving and giving and giving and never once, not even once, saying what it needs in return. Slowly. So slowly that you have not noticed it until now. The warmth begins to curdle into something sharper. The giving starts to feel less like a love language and more like a debt the other person owes you. A debt they have not even been told about. A debt they cannot possibly repay because they do not know it exists. And you watch them walking through their days with the easy, careless freedom of a person who has no idea what they have been quietly accumulating in your name. The clinical psychologist Harriet Lerner, who spent decades studying the actual mechanics of intimate relationships rather than describing them in ways that would make her popular on the lecture circuit, wrote, "We cannot make another person change. But when we change our own behavior, the relationship must change too." She was pointing at the hidden engine of relational breakdown, not cruelty, not betrayal, not the dramatic infidelity that the movies keep recycling. The hidden engine is the failure to ever be honest about what you actually need from the people you love. The Stoics had a technical term for the alternative, oikiosis, a Greek word that has no precise English equivalent, but that refers roughly to appropriate connection, appropriate belonging. The recognition that genuine human relationship is not built on your own effacement. It is built on your own disclosure, not on shrinking yourself to become more acceptable, on being visible enough, clearly enough, in your actual preferences and your actual limits, that the right people, the ones you want, can actually find you where you actually are. When you are endlessly accommodating, when you shape yourself to fit whatever the other person needs in the moment, when you never assert your own preferences and never name your own limits and never stake a flag in the ground in any of the small daily negotiations that constitute a real relationship, you do not create intimacy. You create a mirror. And people cannot truly love a mirror. They can use it. They can look into it, briefly, to confirm whatever they already suspected about themselves. But sooner or later, and the sooner often arrives sooner than you would like, even that becomes lonely. Even looking into a mirror that never says anything back, that never disagrees, that never says that does not work for me, becomes a strange and heavy kind of aloneness. The loneliness of being present but invisible. The loneliness of being familiar but not known. Say what you need, not as a demand, not as an ultimatum, as an honest, public, and undecorated offering of who you actually are. Because the people who stay, when they can see you, when they have been shown enough of the actual shape of you, are the only ones worth keeping. Destruction 9, your own life quietly fades in the sunlight. The ninth destruction is the most existential. It operates at the level of your entire life's actual direction, rather than at the level of any individual relationship or any individual Tuesday. When you have spent years, possibly decades, quietly and systematically prioritizing everyone else's goals, everyone else's dreams, everyone else's timelines, everyone else's urgent needs, something happens to your own. They do not disappear overnight. If they disappeared overnight, you would notice. You would grieve them properly. You would take an evening off to mourn what you had lost. Instead, they fade. The way a photograph fades when it is left too long in direct sunlight. One day the image is vivid, sharp, full of detailed edges you can describe to anyone who asks. A year later, the same image is bleached out. Another year later, and you are not even sure what you are looking at anymore. You can see that something used to be there. But you can no longer tell whether the thing you used to want is actually something you ever wanted, or whether it was only something you once thought you should have wanted because someone you loved expected you to want it. There is a name for what gets left behind. It is called a deferred life. And it is one of the great unspoken tragedies of the human experience, the tragedy that does not arrive as a single dramatic event, but accumulates, year after year. And a form of choices that each individually looked reasonable, and that collectively added up to someone else living inside your time. The palliative care nurse Bronnie Ware, who spent years sitting quietly with people in the final weeks of their lives, recording what they said when they had stopped performing what they thought they were supposed to say, found a pattern she could not have predicted when she started. The most common regret among the dying was not something dramatic. It was not the regret of having traveled too little. It was not the regret of not having learned a third language, or not having climbed the mountain they had always said they would climb. It was this: I wish I had had the courage to live a life true to myself. Not the life others expected of me. Not I wish I had been kinder. Not I wish I had given more. The most common regret, on the operating table, on the deathbed, on the inside of the awareness that this is most likely the last time I will be able to revise anything, was self-abandonment. The slow, voluntary, socially celebrated surrender of one's own path in favor of someone else's. Marcus Aurelius, even as Emperor of Rome, even surrounded by people whose every need he was expected to absorb without complaint, wrote in the same private journals we have been quoting throughout, "The object of life is not to be on the side of the majority, but to escape finding oneself in the ranks of the insane." He was not talking about literal derangement. He was talking about the specific, well-documented insanity of spending an entire human life performing a role rather than inhabiting your own story. You have a story. It is yours, not your parents', not your partner's, not your colleagues', not any of the long sequence of people who have, over the years, handed you their emergencies and thanked you for absorbing them. Yours. And every time you sacrifice a piece of your own path to walk a stretch of someone else's every postponed project, every unsaid no, every silenced preference, every morning you open the laptop to begin someone else's task before you had begun your own, the story gets a little shorter, a little less vivid, a little more like someone else's life that you are accidentally living in the body that was supposed to be yours. The Stoics were not advocating for selfishness. They were advocating for something considerably rarer and considerably harder: the disciplined, intentional, daily practice of remaining the author of your own life, even while being genuinely present and genuinely caring for the people who have been placed in the same small radius as you. These are not contradictions. But they require something that chronic kindness, without a boundary, erodes until it is no longer intact. They require the courage to choose yourself first. Destruction 10. This is not sustainable. And it will not sustain. The 10th destruction is the one that closes the entire pattern. It is the one that explains in retrospect why the first 9 felt so inevitable. Nobody can sustain what you are doing. Not indefinitely. Not at the rate you are doing it. Kindness without a boundary is not a personality type. It is not a spiritual gift you were born with. It is not a virtue. It is a misallocation of resources operating at the speed of life itself. And every resource misallocation in every system in every domain ends the same way, in collapse. The human nervous system was not designed for chronic, sustained, uninterrupted self-sacrifice. The human heart was not built for indefinitely giving without receiving. The human mind cannot indefinitely process the weight of everyone else's problems while ignoring the weight of its own. The Stoics spoke often, with considerable precision, about what they called the reserve clause, a principle they applied to every single thing they did. The principle was this: in everything you do, do it fully, with complete commitment. Hold nothing back in the action itself, but hold in your mind, in parallel, the quiet awareness that you are also a finite being with finite resources, and that protecting those resources deliberately and without apology is not selfishness. It is the precondition for everything else you might want to do in the world. Think about what happens, over time, to the doctor who has not slept in 3 days, the teacher who has not rested in a quarter, the parent who has not been intentionally resourced by themselves or by anyone else in years. They do not become more giving. They become less. They become brittle. They become reactive. They become resentful of the very people they are giving to. They become unable to give anything at all anymore. They become, eventually, unable to recognize the people they have been giving to, including themselves. Theodore Roosevelt, one of the most physically and intellectually vigorous leaders America ever produced, a man who genuinely did not know how to be still, a man whose entire presence was a kind of demonstration of what sustained energy can accomplish, had, in private, a strict and uncompromising policy of renewal. He hiked. He read voraciously and without apology. He boxed. He wrote. He went to the wilderness, by himself, on purpose, for no other reason than to be alone with his own thoughts long enough to know which of his thoughts were still his, not despite his enormous responsibilities. Because of them. He understood something that most people arrive at too late, usually after a collapse, usually after a diagnosis, usually after some version of the body or the mind or the nervous system simply refusing to continue carrying what has been quietly being asked of it. The most responsible thing you can do for the people who depend on you is to remain someone who is capable of being depended upon. Take the long view. Protect your energy with the same vigilance you have been protecting everyone else's. Know when to stop. Know when to stop without requiring permission from the person whose request you are about to decline. Because the version of you that has rested, that has been fed by work that fits it, by rest that is not performative, by relationships that give back at least some fraction of what they take, that has been allowed to want things, to choose things, to say no without needing to manufacture a justification afterward. That version of you, the one who has been allowed to be whole, is not less generous than the version of you that has been worn down to a husk. That version of you is the only version that can give sustainably, beautifully, freely, without the hidden, accumulated cost of your own slow disappearance. The prescription. So what do you actually do with all of this? What is the Stoic prescription for someone who has recognized themselves in any of the 10 patterns above and has decided, with the quiet seriousness that recognition produces, to find a way through? The first step is awareness. And you have already taken it. The Stoic tradition does not begin with action. It begins with attention. Marcus Aurelius filled his journals with honest self-examination, not because he was a wise man by nature, but because he was a man full of self-doubt and fatigue and temptation, who had understood, possibly earlier than the rest of us, that you cannot change what you refuse to look at clearly. Look at where you are giving from. Look at whether the giving comes from fullness or from fear. Look at whether the giving, on balance, enlarges you or diminishes you. Look at your face in the mirror after a hard week of being the reliable one. Look at whether the person looking back from the glass is someone you would want to spend an evening with. Be honest. The mirror does not lie. The second step is learning genuinely, structurally, in your bones to use the word no. Not as a rejection. Not as a wall. As a boundary. And a boundary is not a wall. A wall keeps everything out. A boundary says this far, and I remain myself, and what is on the other side of the boundary is allowed to exist without me having to absorb it. Practice it. Say it quietly at first. Say it when the stakes are low and the people are forgiving. Build the muscle because like every muscle it will shake and feel insufficient at the beginning, and later it will start to feel like a part of you that was there all along. Every no you say to something that diminishes you is, at the same moment, a yes to something that restores you. The third step is to put yourself on your own calendar. This sounds almost insultingly simple. It is one of the most structurally powerful changes you can make. Block out, in your actual calendar, the hours that belong to you for rest, for the creative work that makes you feel like yourself, for the private pursuits that have nothing to do with anyone else's emergency. And defend those hours with precisely the same rigor you have been defending everyone else's schedule for years. Because you are not less important than the people you help. You are equally important. And it is time you started behaving in accordance with that fact instead of merely believing it in the abstract. The fourth step is to audit your actual relationships. Not with cruelty. Not with judgment. Not with the kind of moral zeal that produces more drama than the audit was supposed to prevent. With clear eyes. Ask yourself, with genuine honesty, who in your life is giving as much as they are taking? Who shows up for you the way you have been showing up for them, on the hard days as well as the easy ones? After spending time with whom do you feel expanded, and after spending time with whom do you feel inside a small but unmistakable shrinkage? And then, gradually, deliberately, with no announcement required, redistribute your energy accordingly. Move toward the people who refill you. Create some distance, without permanent rupture, from the people whose presence in your life has come to feel indistinguishable from the presence of a slow leak in a tire. And through all of it, come back to this. The central insight of Stoic philosophy. The thing Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus and Seneca all circle back to across thousands of pages written in different centuries and different languages and in different circumstances they could not have predicted when they started writing. You are not responsible for what happens to you. But you are absolutely, completely, inescapably responsible for what you choose to do about it, including, at long last, the choice to stop handing yourself away. The world does not need any more martyrs. It does not need any more hollowed-out people walking through their one and only life with the perfect posture of generosity and the interior architecture of a building that has been emptied of everything that made it a building in the first place. What the world actually needs, what the people around you actually need, is for you to be genuinely whole, to be rested, to be resourced, to be the kind of person who gives not because they are afraid to refuse, but because they have chosen, deliberately and without apology, from a place of fullness, with a clear understanding of what they are giving and why. That is not selfishness. That is the most radical form of generosity there is. And it begins with the unflinching recognition that the kindness which destroys you was never, in any honest accounting, kindness at all. It was self-erasure in borrowed clothing. And the world has already lost enough of you. Stop. look at the shape of the life you are currently living and decide, today, what parts of it are yours to keep.